We're trying something new with this program. We are trying to stream through Twitch, so probably won't see anything different on your end, but just to let you know, we have that as an option for a couple of our programs now, and so we'll see how that goes. So welcome to Transgender 101 with the Deerfield Public Library. I'm very excited to welcome Nikk Cochran Selik. He is a consultant and speaker who has been working to promote awareness around transgender identity since 2011. A former leader in the Chicago LGBTQ community, Nikk is a founder of one of the largest trans-led organizations in the Midwest, Transmasculine Alliance Chicago, and has worked with Northwestern Medicine to develop their Gender Pathways program. In 2018, Nikk received the Windy City Times 30 Under 30 Award for Outstanding Contributions to the Chicago LGBTQ community. So awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. And so yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat and we will get to those at the end of the program. And let's see, what do we have coming up? We've got a lot of programs coming up this summer, so if you're not registered for other things, please feel free to do that. This program is being recorded and will be up on our YouTube channel. Maybe tomorrow, we'll see how fast I can get to it. But yeah, so all right, well, I'm going to turn it over to Nikk.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jamie. Hello, everyone. Good evening. So to start off, I'd like to first of all give a big thank you to Deerfield Public Library for having me come speak in this virtual space. And most of all, I would like to thank all of you, whether you're watching this webinar live or recording of it or viewing it live on Twitch. Thank you for being here with us tonight. So this Transgender 101 program will consist of a presentation with slides, and we're going to do a Q&A at the end, and this will be about 60 minutes. So let's get started. Before we get, though, into the content, I hope we can all align with just a few working agreements here for tonight's presentation. The first one, we're all here to learn. It's okay if you don't know something, please be honest. You won't be judged or criticized, and that is provided you are coming, of course, from a place of respect. And the second one is assume positive intent, which means that I will operate under the assumption that everyone here is coming from a place of respect, and that you can also assume the same of me. And I hope we can let that be the only assumption we make here for now. And lastly, just keep an open mind. Try to challenge the way you think about things. And whether or not you're already familiar with this topic, I genuinely believe that you will learn something new and gain valuable insight from our discussion. And lastly, like I said, there will be a Q&A at the end. So please utilize the chat for the Q&A. You can also do questions on Twitch, I believe, but we'll address that at the end. If there are technical issues that come up, also feel free to utilize that chat within Zoom. Otherwise, you're in the webinar format, we will not be able to see or hear you speak. So utilize that chat if anything comes up. Okay, so I know Jamie gave me a wonderful intro. Just to reiterate though, again, my name is Nikk Cochran Selik. I use he, him pronouns, and I've been a consultant and speaker for over 10 years, and I am the transgender expert, an expert on transgender identity. I was born and raised in Metro Detroit, and I moved to Chicago when I was 18. And I lived there for 15 years, 15, sounded like I said 50, I'm not, no, 15. And I relocated to Boston last fall, so that's where I'm at now. I originally moved to Chicago to pursue a Bachelor of Arts degree in film from Columbia College. And during my junior year in the fall of 2008, I came out as a transgender man. I was 20 years old at the time. About 2 years later, I began sharing my story publicly, and thus basically started my career as a speaker and consultant. Since then, I've spoken to numerous organizations, conferences, businesses, schools, libraries, and families across the country about what it means to be transgender. And then in 2016, I founded TMAC, Transmasculine Alliance Chicago, which I'm proud to say is actually now one of the largest trans-led organizations in the Midwest. I served as the leader of TMAC for 5 years while volunteering at the Center on Halsted in Lakeview. And during that time, I facilitated our meetings and presented on topics that were educational to our community. We even got to march in the Pride Parade a couple of times with the Center on Halsted. And this photo on the screen here is actually from Pride in 2017. We had our own shirts. And actually someone from this photo just tried to call me. And yeah, it's kind of funny. Anyways, still good friends with everyone, even though I'm not in Chicago. And then additionally, I've gotten experience working with parents of transgender youth and the kids and teens themselves through Lurie Children's Hospital as a volunteer in their Trans Mentor program. And I'm continuing my work with Northwestern Medicine on their Gender Pathways program, albeit remotely. And I've done some transgender competency trainings for their staff and providers as well. And then here in my current role in Boston, I'm the coordinator for a national program, which is aimed at expanding access to gender affirming healthcare in rural areas of the country through providing education to clinical and frontline staff at these health centers. And that is why I left Chicago. It had to be something big. And it's been a really great journey so far, but I really miss the Chicago area. But enough about me. So now that you've met me, I'd like to introduce you to my family. On the left is a photo of me with my mom, dad, and younger sister from 2001. And on the right is us at a Detroit Lions game in 2015. I don't think they won that day, but I don't think they win a lot of games. Sorry if there's any Lions fans. But I remember when I told my family that I was transgender for the first time. And I know they didn't quite understand everything then, but the important thing was they told me that they would still love me and support me no matter what. And just as my transition was a process, it was also a process for the rest of my family. It took a little bit of time, but everyone came around eventually with calling me Nikk and using he, him pronouns. I know I wouldn't be where I'm at today without the love, support, and patience of my family. And I genuinely hope that by sharing my experiences with you here, that you can hopefully learn from this as well. In the process of understanding the meaning of transgender and what that's all about, it's helpful to start by identifying some of the existing associations we most likely have between the concepts of sex and gender, and namely that they do not mean the same thing, although that's probably what we were taught back in grade school. Let's start with something we're all pretty familiar with, right? When a baby is born, the doctor says it's a boy or it's a girl based on the baby's anatomy. And then this male or female label is stamped on the baby's birth certificate. And this is supposedly who they are and who they will be forever and ever. We are all taught that our anatomy, namely our genitals, determine who we are for the rest of our lives. And perhaps it may sound a bit silly when I put it to you that way, but this is a practice that we as a society abide by. So the word sex is more accurately defined as the assignment of male or female at birth based on anatomy. And when we use the term assigned sex at birth rather than saying something like biological sex, we're shifting the view and we're acknowledging that someone else is making this decision for us based on our bodies and our genitals. But here's what's really interesting with that whole practice of assigning everyone male or female at birth. We still do this even though we know that roughly 2% of the population is born intersex. Intersex means that the person is born with one of many possible variations in chromosomes, hormones, and or genitals that do not fit the typical definitions of male or female bodies. And I want to be clear that this is not the same thing as being transgender. I promise we'll talk more about that in a bit. But it is very important, however, to note, first of all, that intersex people do in fact exist, which means inherently the practice of assigning everyone either male or female at birth is not accurate for 100% of the population. On the other hand, the term gender is a bit more difficult to define than sex because it is a truly complex and multifaceted concept. So in order to define it, it's helpful to break it down into three components, which are gender identity, expression, and roles. So starting off with gender identity, this is a deeply held internal sense of self as being male, female, both, neither, or somewhere in between. And it's okay if the last part, talking about both, neither, somewhere in between, doesn't make sense to you right now. I promise we will also address that in further detail shortly. But the key concept for now is that gender identity is how you experience yourself and who you know yourself to be on the inside. And lastly, although we use the word identity, it does not mean that it's a choice. Then there is gender expression. This is basically how we show our internal gender identity on the outside. We do this through things like our appearance, our clothing, hair, makeup, behavior, mannerisms, all of that. And little kids know this concept really well. If you ask them, oh, the person they're wearing a dress and they have long hair, so they must be a girl. Pants and short hair equals boy. So notice that we have these existing associations with how someone should express their gender as well. And that leads me to the third component, which is gender roles. And this refers to a set of behaviors and expectations learned by a person as appropriate to their gender. So that means from the moment we are born and when that male or female label is stamped on our birth certificate, we are then taught to behave like said boy or girl. And this is reinforced heavily, really, throughout the rest of our lives. I don't really think it ends. But here's the really interesting piece about gender roles is that they are also influenced by cultural norms. They are not universal. And what that means is that our current expectations for men and women here in the US in 2022 are different from other cultures around the world and throughout history. They have not always been the same everywhere in the world forever. This photo here demonstrates the ever prevalent belief that all people in our society are to be categorized as being either male or female. And this is known as the gender binary. The problem, of course, with the gender binary is that not everyone in the entire world fits these rigid definitions of male or female. And as you may be able to imagine, not fitting neatly into either box can make some things most people take for granted, like using a public bathroom, a big nightmare, to say the least. This is because most people are cisgender. And I hope that some of you have heard this term before. If not, here to explain it. So cis is a prefix that means same. So cisgender means that the person's gender identity is the same as the sex they were assigned at birth. And this is not meant to be a label or a judgment or anything like that, but it's really a more accurate descriptor when we're talking about this. Because the word cisgender exists, and even if you haven't heard it before, I guarantee you will start to hear it more. But this exists to fill a gap that would otherwise exist in language, and that has previously been filled with words like normal or regular, which of course position people who are not cisgender as weird or abnormal, or there's something wrong with them as a result. While being cisgender is certainly more common, using words like normal and all of that can have a very denigrating connotation for those who are not cisgender. And of course, when I'm talking about those who are not cisgender, I'm alluding to our next term, which is transgender. I promised we'd get there, and we're there now. So here's the definition. Transgender means that someone's gender identity or who they know themselves to be is different than the sex they were assigned at birth. And please note that there's a couple kind of grammatical things to pay attention to on the left. So the correct word to use is transgender. There's no ED at the end. It's not transgendered. Also, a transgender or transgenders is not correct. You can say a transgender person or transgender people. The term transgenderism kind of scares me. It's really not, it's not used oftentimes with positive intent, right? It's usually used with the intention of saying harmful things. So I would encourage folks not to use that term as well. However, it is generally acceptable to use the term trans just as an abbreviation for transgender. There's a lot of syllables there, so trans is fine as an adjective. And this is used a lot within the community too, so you will hear that often. But you might be thinking, you know, the definition of transgender, like that's pretty broad, generalized, and that is on purpose. And that's why the word transgender is often thought of as an umbrella term, because there are many different types of gender identities that can fall underneath it. So there's a lot there, but two that we can bring up for now are ones that we can think of as binary transgender identities. So we have trans man and trans woman. Hopefully the graphic is self-explanatory. But again, so these are people that identify as either male or female within the gender binary. There are also some terms that have been used for trans men and trans women previously. But these terms, while some folks do still use them for themselves or whatnot, they are generally being shifted away from within the past like 5 or 10 years. So again, trans man and trans woman, or transgender man, transgender woman, those are the appropriate terms to use. And lastly, I mentioned that I do work within a medical setting, and sometimes we do need to talk about sex assigned at birth. So AFAB and AMAB, hopefully some of you have seen these before, but what this stands for is assigned female or male at birth. And again, this is more accurate and acceptable to use when we need to refer to things like this. It's also important to note that while many transgender people do identify, like I said, within the gender binary as men or women, there are also many transgender people who do not. Non-binary is the commonly used term to describe someone's gender identity that falls outside of exclusively either male or female. And when we previously talked about what gender identity is, this is that part that I was referring to about being both, neither, or somewhere in between male and female. There you go. So I want to be very clear that it is true that the term non-binary is relatively newer, but the concept of humans experiencing their gender outside of the binary is not. Many non-binary people also use gender neutral pronouns, such as the singular they, them. I promise we will talk more about pronouns in a bit. I do realize that for some of you, this may be very new information, but please remember that this is meant to be a starting point. And, this is the 101. What I will also say is you do not have to completely understand or even agree with someone's gender identity in order to be respectful of who they are. Switching away from gender identity for a moment, let's talk about sexual orientation, because this is something that people confuse all the time, these two terms. They do not mean the same thing, but they can be viewed rather as intersecting aspects of our whole identity. And I find that this is a part that people can get a bit stuck on when they're first learning. So if that's the case, please bear with me. I will do my best to explain. So again, we know that gender identity describes who someone is. Sexual orientation, on the other hand, describes who someone is attracted to. However you define that, romantically, sexually, physically, whatever. But yes, it describes attraction. On the left here, we have some very common examples of sexual orientations, and I assure you there are many more possibilities. This is not an all-inclusive list. We're not going to go through all of these either, but if there are any you would like to know about, please feel free to mention it during the Q&A. But you'll notice that transgender is not on this list. And this is because transgender people can be any of these orientations. Also, dating or being in a relationship with a transgender person does not make someone gay. And being with a transgender person does not actually imply anything about someone's sexual orientation at all. Again, this is because being gay and being transgender are not the same thing. In this case, gay would describe someone's sexual orientation, who they are attracted to, who they love, and transgender would describe gender identity, who they are. Not to confuse anyone, you can be both, but I am both gay and transgender, but not everyone is. So I just want to make that distinction. So again, I know that's something that can be a bit confusing, but hopefully my little summary sentence here to kind of like phrase it, drive the point home. Sexual orientation is who you go to bed with, and gender identity is who you go to bed as. So hopefully that makes a little more sense. Switching back now to gender identity, transgender folks may choose to go through the process of gender affirmation, which has also and is also known as transitioning. However, the word transition, I think, can be a bit misleading as it implies having a start and end point. And although that does make sense on a basic conceptual level, it doesn't quite capture the realities of what it's like to really go through that process. So the word gender affirmation in this context is a little more accurate to use. But again, some folks still say transition, that's fine. Gender affirmation means that the person is shifting away from their sex assigned at birth and towards their authentic gender identity. And keep in mind that there's no prescribed way to do this, as it's extremely dependent on the individual and their desires. Also, going through this process is by no means a requirement for being transgender. Not everyone wants to or can go through this process for many different reasons. Lastly, when we're talking about gender affirmation, it can include social and or medical gender affirmation. By the way, yes, that is me. That's my kind of before and after my gender affirmation. So just to get an idea. So let's talk about what we just mentioned, social and medical. So starting with social, this refers to basically the process of letting others know your true gender and beginning to live your life that way. So it can include the things like you see on the screen here, going by a different name, changing the pronouns you use, and changing your gender expression, right? Hair, clothing, makeup, no makeup in my case, whatever it may be. So that is social gender affirmation. And again, there's more things that can fall under that, but that's kind of a general idea of it. And then medical transition or gender affirmation. So this can refer to usually gender affirming hormone therapy and or gender confirmation surgery. Some people do both. Some people only do one or the other, and some people do neither of those things. But to give a bit of an overview, gender affirming hormone therapy, which is also known as hormone replacement therapy, utilizes testosterone or estrogen to change the person's secondary sex characteristics. So the best way to describe it, it's like going through a second puberty. It can take several years to see the final full effects of hormone therapy. Some people do this only for a short period of time, and some do it for the rest of their lives, depending on many factors. And then the second one, the purpose of gender confirmation surgery, which, by the way, used to be known as sex reassignment surgery, that is a very outdated term. So gender confirmation surgery is definitely the preferred nomenclature there. So the purpose is to, of course, align the person's body with their gender identity. This could be its own, actually, both of those things are their own presentations that I have on my computer. But so I can't go into too much detail, but there are so many different kinds of surgeries and procedures and techniques that can fall under this classification. And it's extremely dependent on the individual and their health desires and all of that. I do want to again emphasize that undergoing surgery or any kind of medical gender affirmation is not a requirement for being transgender. And someone who has not gone through medical gender affirmation is no less valid in their gender than someone who has. In this next part, I'd like to talk very briefly about how to be respectful of transgender folks in general. And I really feel like this is something that everyone should know, regardless of who you are. So yeah, just general tips here. Take a moment to take in the meme, take in the look on her face, because that's exactly reflective of what I'm about to talk about. So I mentioned that many trans people changed their names legally or otherwise as a part of their gender affirmation process. And in more recent years, the trans community has been using this term dead name to refer to their birth name. So dead naming someone would mean using their birth name instead of their correct or chosen name, which, as you can see by the graphic here, is not great. It's not good. And also, you should absolutely never ask a transgender person what their birth name or dead name was. And this may seem kind of obvious, but it's one of those, if I had a nickel, situations, have a lot of nickels. But regardless of the legal status of the name change, it's just very important to use the name that people tell you to use. And I understand that for transgender folks, sometimes it may be necessary to list their legal name on or their dead name on documents, or if you work at a bank or a doctor's office, or you have to list the legal name. I understand that. However, there's some ways to make it more comfortable for the person or accommodating by still, referring to them by their correct name when addressing them verbally, for instance. So yes. And then we have the other piece of that, which is pronouns, essential to every Trans 101. So pronouns, of course, are how you refer to someone, with the most common examples being here on the screen. Again, not all of them. There are many more. I want to take a moment to talk about the singular they, them pronoun, because that is probably the most common gender neutral pronoun, but there are other alternatives to this. And I want to emphasize that with the singular they, them, I know some folks may struggle with this at first. Sometimes it does take a little bit of practice. But I want to just remind folks that we do use this in language every day. For example, if you're talking about somebody, you don't want the other person to know who you're talking about. You may say, well, they did this or they did that. So just an example. It's a way to frame it perhaps when you're still learning at first. But with pronouns, similarly to the name, again, regardless of if you understand why they use these pronouns or not, it's important to use the pronouns that a transgender person or anyone really wants you to use. A couple of things also about pronouns is pronouns are not preferred. And I know that might sound a bit like particular or nitpicky, but let me explain. So I see this a lot, the preferred pronouns, and I know this is usually well-intentioned, but the word preferred almost implies that it's optional. I'll speak for myself here as a trans person. I mentioned at the beginning that I use he, him pronouns when I introduced myself. Those are simply the pronouns that I use. And I don't prefer that you call me he. Like if you don't, I'm going to think you're not talking about me. Like I will be very confused or I will correct you, which I usually don't have to do. But anyways, you might be thinking though, Nikk, you look like a man. So of course, why wouldn't I call you he? And while this may be true, you cannot always tell what someone's pronouns are just by looking at them, which is why it's important to try not to assume based on the person's gender expression. And this is why I put into practice introducing myself with my name and pronouns. And I would encourage folks here to do the same, regardless of your gender identity. Having said that, though, how do you know what someone's pronouns are if you can't tell just by looking? Well, this is when asking respectfully would be the right move if you aren't sure. My go-to phrase, because I know it can be a little awkward, especially if you've never asked that question before, and I have to ask it a lot because I try not to assume. But if I'm not sure, I say, may I ask what pronouns you use? That way you're giving the person an opportunity to say, no, I don't want to tell you, which I haven't really had that experience, but 9 times out of 10, they will appreciate that question, trust me. Now, of course, sometimes you will make a mistake and accidentally misgender someone or use the wrong pronouns to refer to them. Now, most of the transgender 101s out there would tell you to just apologize and move on. I want to take this to the next level and encourage folks to say thank you, for correcting me. Repeat what you just were saying with the correct pronoun and then continue talking. Because I feel like all too often people get really caught off guard when they're corrected and they feel embarrassed or defensive. And there's this big tendency to over explain and, apologize and make excuses and all that. So this is why I think a simple thank you for correcting me, or just thank you. Anyways, she loves Star Wars or whatever you were saying. It's sufficient and effective. It makes it a lot less awkward for everybody. The last part of this little section here is my top 6 tips to keep in mind for being respectful. Number 1, I love this so much, I put it back in here. Yes, I did. You do not have to understand someone's gender identity to respect it. Kind of speaks for itself. Number 2, someone's transgender identity is their private information to share or not share. So just keep in mind, if someone has told you that they are transgender, does not necessarily mean that they have told everyone in their life or that they want everyone to know. It's the person's choice whether to disclose that or not. So just please be mindful of not sharing others' private information here out of safety or whatever reason it may be. Number 3, there is no one right way to be transgender. Again, some transgender people choose to go through medical gender affirmation and some don't. And some people want to, but they can't for many reasons. And a transgender person's identity does not depend on what things they have or haven't done to transition. Number 4, we just talked about this, but to reiterate, use the name and pronouns that people ask you to use. It's also okay to ask what pronouns someone uses respectfully if you aren't sure, or you can start by sharing your own like I did at the beginning. Number 5, continue to educate yourself. There is a lot of information out there available now more than ever. Libraries are great. Also, I have found that when you Google things, generally the information that comes up first tends to be accurate and from reputable sources. So usually that's a safe bet, but just be wary of where you're getting your information from. And YouTube is another good one for directly from trans folks themselves sharing their experiences and such. And lastly, no one is perfect. So this might seem like a lot of information, but keep in mind that the transgender community is extremely, extremely diverse, and everyone's experience is different. And I do not speak for everyone, and I don't mean to or imply that I do. But again, the important thing is just that you are respectful, that you do the best you can, and keep trying and keep an open mind. And it's sometimes a little bit of a process to learn. In this very last part here, before we move into our Q&A, I do want to take a moment to address some special considerations for transgender youth and adolescents. As we've seen recently, the concept of gender affirmation for young folks has become a massive legislative target, as well as the center of much unwarranted controversy, fueled by the intentional spread of misinformation. Having said that, I'd like to start this portion here by addressing perhaps one of the most common concerns around transgender youth and teens. Aren't they a little too young to know? I'd like to answer that question with this photo, which was taken on Halloween in 1997. On the right is my little sister again at 6 years old, wearing the 1950s costume with the pink poodle skirt and the wig that looks like it needs a little bit of work. Anyway, then we have me at 9 years old on the left, wearing the ninja costume with the dagger and the blacked out tooth, looking all sorts of scary, I guess. But growing up, this was very par for the course. Every Halloween, I got so excited. It was just an opportunity for me to dress up in a boy's costume for the day, while my sister, year after year, just wanted to be the pretty, pretty princess, in different variations. But my point in showing you this photo is to demonstrate, perhaps in a more visual capacity, that transgender youth are not too young to know who they are. In fact, many transgender adults, myself included, have known that they were transgender or somehow different from a very young age, but we did not necessarily have the words or the knowledge or the ability to express this at the time. But on the other hand, it is equally important to acknowledge that many children do express what we would usually consider to be cross-gender traits or behaviors or tendencies at different points throughout their development. And this does not inherently mean that they are or they will be transgender. So how can you tell? Okay, well, a simple guideline and a sort of mantra used commonly among parents of trans youth is if in regards to their gender identity, they are insistent, persistent, and consistent, then they may be transgender. And what we mean by this is insistent, unwavering, persistent, being continuing firmly in spite of difficulty or opposition, and consistent, unchanging in nature over a period of time. And to be clear, this is by no means meant to be a definitive test, but rather something to observe over time in order to provide the proper guidance that is still gender affirming and honors who they really are. As with any young person, having parental support at home plays a large role in their social and psychological development. However, if they happen to be transgender, the factor of parental involvement tends to have a magnified influence, for better or for worse. Unfortunately, there are many transgender youth and teens out there who lack the support they need to thrive as themselves. Rejection comes in various forms, of course, but this does include some extreme measures like conversion therapy. Many organizations, including the American Psychological Association, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, as well as the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, have strongly asserted that attempting to prevent or change a young person's gender identity in any form is ineffective and can be extremely harmful. Some examples of ways that the trauma of rejection can manifest include psychological problems such as depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and suicidal ideation or attempts. And some of these problems may become apparent immediately, while others may not come to the surface until later in adulthood, because repression is a real thing. But at the heart of this, any practice that pathologizes transgender identity or views it as a problem or an illness often has long-lasting damaging consequences. Realistically, though, it's not possible to entirely prevent all of the problems young folks may experience in life related to their gender identity. However, the good news is most of them can be proactively mitigated through providing support and allowing access to gender affirmation. Gender affirmation is something that I know we talked about for adults, but in the context of youth and adolescents, there are, again, some special considerations, and we can look at this as 4 components. So the first one is psychological gender affirmation. This means that they feel their gender identity is seen, validated, and respected by their parents, family, teachers, peers, etc. It means they are not shamed or made to feel guilty for who they are. And it also means that they are not forced to constantly explain or have to justify their gender identity to others. The second component, which builds off of the first one, is social gender affirmation. And I know we spoke about that one in relation to adults, but for this one, social gender affirmation can refer to being able to express and present their gender identity, whether it be, again, through things like clothing, hair, makeup, all of that, in ways that are consistent with how they experience themselves. It also means that they are referred to by their correct or chosen name and pronouns, which we also talked about. And sometimes the name or pronouns they use may change later on, and that's okay. The point is that by not enforcing our own expectations of gender upon youth and teens, we're allowing them the freedom to explore who they really are as they develop in ways that are both healthy and affirming. The third component is legal gender affirmation, which involves a lot of paperwork. But yes, of course, it revolves around name changes and correcting gender markers on legal documents. A couple of things to consider with this are the birth certificate, social security card, passport, and specifically for teens, driver's licenses and state IDs. It's important to note that some states actually do not allow gender marker changes on documents at all. Illinois is definitely not one of them. And fortunately, the process has, for the most part, become easier and more accessible with less red tape involved in the past 5 years or so. And lastly, there is medical gender affirmation. Again, within the context of youth and adolescents, this can include a few things. The first one we're going to talk about has been a source of a lot of the controversy. So I want to be very clear on this one here. Puberty blockers. Okay, so what do those do? As the name implies, puberty blockers is a treatment that pauses natal or endogenous puberty and prevents secondary sex characteristics from developing in puberty age adolescents. So it pauses puberty. And despite the myths that continue to be perpetuated around the quote unquote dangers of gender affirming treatment, puberty blockers are in fact safe to use. And we've known this for a long time. Both the Endocrine Society and WPATH, which stands for the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, support the use of puberty blockers for youth who want to delay or prevent these unwanted physical changes. And in general, the US Food and Drug Administration has also approved this treatment a long time ago for youth who start puberty at too young of an age. The other part of puberty blockers is that they are also, in fact, reversible. This means that even if the youth were to, let's say, change their mind, despite having met the rigorous criteria before even beginning this type of medical intervention, but they can stop the treatment and their endogenous puberty will resume. But also consider the other side of that endogenous puberty itself is not reversible. It's physically permanent and often psychologically damaging for trans people to go through. Several recent studies have shown the many benefits to utilizing this treatment to delay puberty, including improved mental health, improved peer interactions, and it may eliminate the need for future surgeries. And the last one, or there's two more, gender affirming hormone therapy and gender confirmation surgery. So we talked about both of those, but I just want to again clarify in the context of, in this case, adolescents. So gender affirming hormone therapy would ideally be started when the adolescent would start puberty corresponding with their correct gender identity. But it is okay. I mean, some folks do start gender affirming hormone therapy later in life as an adult. Like I said, I did when I was 20, and it can still be effective. So there's that. And then the last one, gender confirmation surgery. This is just a consideration for older adults, or I'm sorry, older teens and adults only. So despite some claims, they're not performing like gender surgeries on children, on young children. But again, the whole thing about surgery, it's a very personal matter and not a qualifier for being transgender. In conclusion, having access to gender affirmation has been shown time and time again to be quite literally life-saving. Despite the fact that the transgender community is a highly vulnerable population that continues to be politically attacked while subjected to widespread discrimination, time and time again, we have proven ourselves to be fearlessly authentic and extraordinarily resilient. And with that, one moment. Guy rides his motorcycle every day, same time. But thank you. That was good timing. Thank you very much for that. And we will now move into our Q&A. I know we have a couple minutes left. I'm going to leave this up here for a second before we do that. This is my email and my website. If anyone would like to reach out, if you have any questions that you don't want to say during the program here, or follow-up questions or anything really, you want to leave me a review, that'd be great, for my website. Feel free to reach out. Happy to talk. So with that, we'll move into our Q&A. I'll take this off of here in a second. I just want to clarify that any questions are okay in this setting. I know I said like don't ask invasive questions, but it's okay for this setting. I'm happy to answer pretty much anything. So let me take this out. Go back to, there we go. Okay, so let's see here. I got some questions. So I have a question from Twitch that I'm going to start with. So how do you refer to someone who now identifies as trans historically? So if I want to address Elliot Page, but want to talk about the movie Juno, when Elliot went by Ellen, what is respectful? That is a great question. So a general rule of thumb, if we're talking about a transgender person prior to their coming out, their gender affirmation, whatever, we always want to use the current name and pronouns that they go by, even if it's not what they went by at the time. I know that Netflix, for example, has updated all of Elliot Page's credits to say Elliot Page, even though perhaps the movie credits, you can't really go back and change that. But again, this is about accommodating and just updating things as needed. And it's also the other side. I'll just use myself as an example. My older sister, who I did not show in this presentation, no reason. I mean, but she's 18 years older than me, so I didn't really grow up with her. But anyways, she had a really bad habit of at first referring to me in the past when she was, telling old stories, wherever she'd say she, and people get really confused because they're like, she, they didn't know me or whatever. And that was always like really didn't feel good, because I don't really, I mean, it's just like, again, the private information to share or not share. There's really no reason to kind of go back and hammer that, you know what I mean? So I would just say, rule of thumb, use the current name and pronouns even if you're not talking about current times. Thank you for that question. The second question from Twitch, what does it mean when people use he/them or she/them for pronouns? And that is also a great question. Thank you. So I know I said that pronouns are not preferred. However, this is the one time that people may use multiple sets of pronouns. So I'll use the he, them as an example, because one of my good friends is actually, his pronouns are he, they, and I generally call him he. He does not have a preference between the two. So that's the only time you could have a preferred pronoun, is if there are multiple sets of pronouns that folks may use. And sometimes that's contingent upon like where they're at, for example, if we're out at a bar or whatever, you might want me not to call them them because it might, I don't know, for whatever reason, or if we're in a more space with other LGBTQ plus folks, it might change. So it's dependent on the person and the space that they're in. But that is probably one of the only times that I have asked folks, do you have a preference between the two? But otherwise, generally, I feel like folks are fine with using either. So it depends on the person, but thank you for that question. I hope that makes sense. The second question or third question is, what steps would you suggest a transgender person take if they feel unsafe in their environment? That is a good question, and I can totally understand that there are many factors, right, that could cause a transgender person to feel unsafe in their environment. I guess that would really depend on what environment and what it was. I know that in certain cases, let's say at work, let's say if it's within a work context or even housing situations, that's when why it's important to have these laws that protect trans people and LGBTQ folks against discrimination at work or with housing, etc. And I would say, if it's something that this person is able to do, sometimes you do have to get legal help. And there are a lot of great resources, especially within Illinois, some of which do pro bono work for trans folks. So I appreciate that question. I'm sorry, I don't have a more specific answer, but what I will generally say is, where there is a will, there is a way. And even if it requires a little research or asking community members, there is help available for folks. Okay, we have another question for, can you explain what pansexual means? Thank you, that's a great question. So pansexual, so we got another prefix. Pan means all ALL. And the idea of pansexual is that the person may be attracted to all genders. And you might be thinking, well, how is that different than being bisexual? And that is a whole art, like a whole thing, right? That's my other presentation that I don't actually have that one, but it could be. My general take on that is all gender is more inclusive than both genders, although some pansexual folks will also identify as bisexual. It's just kind of a different way of framing it. Another take on that is I've heard this little summary of hearts, not parts. So it's more about the person than what their anatomy or their physiology is. And that's how some folks may look at it. But thank you for that question. I hope that makes sense. Does anyone else have any questions? I'll give folks a moment to post in the chat if they do, or on the Twitch.
I don't see anything else from Twitch. Nikk, this was really informative. Thank you so much. I understand why you come so highly recommended. So this was awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. Awesome. Well, with that, I thank you all very much. And thank you again to Jamie and Deerfield Public Library for having me. And I wish you all happy rest of your Pride Month and happy rest of your summer.
That's right. All right. Well, thank you. You guys all have a great night.
Thank you.